Okay, we will get started and people can join us as they come in, but won't keep all of you who are here ready and waiting. To start, I'm Jen Kafish. I'm the owner and founder of Great Expectations College Prep. Pally has been kind of to let us kind of do this webinar series for you guys to give some more specific niche, advice on things. Today's is going to be somewhat broad. I know a lot of the webinars that you've had before have been very specific about whether it's performing arts or athletic recruitment. This is meant if you have, a 9th or 10th grader, or even somebody younger, you're thinking ahead, just starting to think about what colleges view as the most important, why it matters, and making decisions. And I'm going to try to set this up where it's applicable if you're applying to, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, or if you're just simply attempting to go to a four-year college. There's going to be a wide range of things. So understand there's some things I might say that stress you out, in which case I apologize. But some kids need that stress if they're applying super high, and others it's not as important. But I'm going to try to explain and clarify, but know that there is a range here. So one thing, if you have questions, you'll notice there's both a chat and a Q&A box. Please put any questions you have in the Q&A box, not chat. And then at the very end, we'll go over any questions that people have as we've moved throughout. So just again, use that Q&A box for anything you want to ask, and we'll address everything at the end. So, all right, let's get started. So want to break down kind of the components of a college application. And obviously some of these things will change based on what application, what schools you're applying to. So for instance, standardized test scores, right? Already looking at this, if you're applying to the UCs, they're test blind, and we'll talk a lot about that in a little bit when we get to more of just weighing in on standardized testing in general and where it's headed. But know that this is not true for every college application, but for most. So the idea of this lovely little pie chart is to give you a sense of kind of the weight of things. The reality is high school academics are the most important. So in some ways I would have liked to make this 50%. But the reality is if you struggled a little bit academically, but can have killer test scores or did something really amazing with your extracurriculars, then they can balance each other out. So right now I put them as even because again, if something is really incredible, it can balance out slightly lower grades at a lot of schools. Top schools want the best of all of these things. So we're going to break down each section and kind of, what you can do and what you need to be thinking about now and what matters now and what matters later. So let's talk about high school academics. So looking at your classes, looking at the rigor. One of the things that you want to keep in mind when you're looking at high school academics and thinking about your transcript and what you're sending to colleges, what matters here is it's how you compare to your classmates. So I always point out with Pally, it's got so many opportunities for kids and so many APs and honors classes and electives that you can take. I don't want to say it's a disadvantage, but the reality is if you're at a school that doesn't offer APs, it's not held against you. At Pally, you've got everything. So if you say you want to pursue psychology, but you don't take AP psychology or any psychology class, right, and they have it, then that's a problem. They don't have it that year, it's not held against you. So just know that if you're up against classmates who are taking something that you're not taking and are competing for the same type of path, let's say pre-med, right? If you're pre-med, you need to be taking, obviously biology, chemistry, honors is going to be better than regular. If you're really looking to kind of show this is your focus and this is your passion, APs are even better. But one of the things that we want to be careful of, course rigor and your GPA and grades, they fit together, but they can be independent of each other too, because you could have a 4.0, right? And your GPA, you have straight A's, but you've never taken an advanced class. So you might have great grades, but your course rigor is not there. So you haven't really challenged yourself much more than any of your classmates. So some colleges are going to be delighted with a 4.0. Obviously, they're going to be thrilled and go, this kid, brilliant. We're so good. We're happy with this. This is everything we're looking for. Other colleges, especially when you start looking at like the top 25 types of schools on, rankings and the ones that want to see rigor and the grades. So there are plenty of schools, if you're looking as a freshman or sophomore and you're planning what classes, knowing if you're looking at, especially some bigger state schools that are less competitive than, we're not talking Berkeley, UCLA, but if you're looking at, Oregon or Boulder, they're really great schools that are very happy with kids who have strong grades and maybe have taken an honors or AP. The more you've taken, the better your candidate you're going to be, but they care that you've done well, right? If you're applying to Stanford, Stanford cares that you've done well and taken 1,000,000 APs, and they want to see A's in those APs. So keep in mind, this is something where if you're applying, again, to these top schools, it's about balancing. One of the worst, most annoying things you will hear in any info session at any college that's a very competitive college, people always ask, is it better to get a B in an AP class or an A in a regular class? If you're in any of those top 25 types of schools, the answer is going to be an A in the AP class, right? They want to see that you could not only challenge yourself, but do extremely well. So where you're applying really determines how rigorous your courses need to be, but also what you're taking. So like we talked about at the beginning, if you're saying, I want to be a psychology major, but never took psych and your school offers it, then they're going to go, but are you really interested in psychology if you didn't even take it when it was in front of you? So be aware that taking the courses you choose are starting to develop your interests. If you are going to be an engineer, let's say engineering is your path. Colleges, a lot of times, want to make sure that you're at least in calculus as a senior, right? If not AP calculus. But some schools are okay with pre-calc. It's not very common. Usually you need calculus. So as a freshman or a sophomore, you want to be looking ahead. You want to look and say, okay, if I need to be taking calculus as a senior, what does that mean for junior year? What does that mean for sophomore year? And if you realize you're off track, starting to say, how do I fix this, right? Can I either take summer school? Can I move up? And you may not be able to, but you also may. It just depends on what level you're in and kind of where you're at with everything. But recognizing if you try to basically skip ahead with Algebra 2 to get to pre-calc over the summer, that's hard. You're getting to higher level math and just taking it in 2 months over the summer may not go super well. So the next class may be more difficult. So as a freshman or sophomore, you have time to change course if at some point you're like, I'm not on track. So what I recommend though, is Pally can give you, you've got a course guide, right? Where you can see all the classes that are offered, look at everything that's offered senior year, then look at the prerequisites of what you need to take junior year for everything, anything that remotely interests you, not that you don't have to take these, but look ahead and say, if I want to take, AP English, what matters, right? What do I need to take before that? And then work backwards and see if you're on track. If not, talking to the school, figuring out what you're comfortable with, and just making sure, because again, you have time to alter the course if you need to. So that is something with course rigor that I want you to challenge yourself as much as you can without cracking. This is the big thing. We see a lot of students who are very motivated, right? They're very ambitious. They want to take a ton of honors, a ton of APs, and they push themselves too hard and the grades suffer. So we need your mental health to be good. We need your grades to be good. So you've got to find that line, and only you really know as a student and maybe your parents where that line is. So depending on where you're applying, again, I always say challenge yourself as much as you can and still do well. But recognize that some schools, again, want more. Others don't expect as much. They just want to see that you're keeping pace with everyone around you. That leads to class rank. So this is something, a lot of schools today, a lot of high schools don't rank, but this is a little tip. If you look online, you can see what colleges see. So the class profile that your high school sends to colleges, they get a chance to see what percentage of the class has above a 4.0 weighted, right? Or above a 3.0 unweighted, or however you want to look at it. They break it down for colleges so they can see how common is it, because sometimes there's a lot of grade inflation at certain high schools, not others. So they see, for instance, without naming names, there's a West Side private school where I had a girl with a 3.68. She was the bottom 25th percent of her class. So everyone there basically has an A average, right? Or an A minus average in their classes. Colleges are aware of this. So class rank, it's not necessarily about being number 42 out of 712, right? It's not so much about that. It's about where does your GPA fall generally with other people. And if you're applying to the competitive schools, a lot of that has to do with how many APs you're taking, but there's the movement towards not weighting with APs and honors, right? At some schools, and everything's changing year by year. The main thing that matters is looking at your classmates. Are they taking more honors, more APs, and applying to the same colleges? You want to kind of look at that, right? But you also, if thinking about class rank and you're applying to top schools, recognize that the vast majority of top 25 schools want kids who are in the top 10% of their class. This is something that you can also see their class profile. If you go to any top school, like any university on their website, they'll usually tell you how many people or what percentage of their incoming class is from the top 10%. And most of that type of school, it's like 95 to 98%. So not that you have to be, obviously there's exceptions, but a lot of those are artists or athletes, things like that. So class rank kind of, matters on that. Okay, so keeping in mind how you compare to your classmates, that's what your grades are showing people. And by the way, if you have a class that no one's getting an A in, don't stress as much about your B if no one else is getting A's, if those are the same kids who are applying to the colleges you're looking at. So when you're younger right now, I also want to point out, if there's freshmen on this, which there should be, if you're a freshman, there is a big myth out there that freshman year does not matter. It does. So let's talk about freshman year grades in the context of different colleges and different applications. So for instance, let's say you are applying to pretty much any private school. They take your GPA average from grade 9 through 11. And then you will eventually send first semester senior year grades if you're applying, mid-year. Then before they make everything firm and official and you put in your deposits and everything, they still want to make sure that your grades are good through the end of senior year. So all 4 years matter. The reason that myth gets started is if you look at the UC application. The UC application takes your GPA from grades 10 and 11. It does not include 9th grade, but you have to list your 9th grade classes and grades. So they still see them. So when you have people going around saying, I'm not going to try freshman year because it doesn't matter, colleges don't see it, just be aware that they very much do, and this very much matters. As you enter sophomore year, there are going to be more opportunities to take more honors, more APs. And this is where, like we talked about, setting your course and recognizing what you can take each year. Try, if you think you're interested and able, try taking AP World History, right? Take, an AP Science, take whatever you're basically allowed to take if you're interested in it. The number that you take. So a lot of people ask how many APs, how many honors. Again, it goes back to my answer, which is it depends on how many you can handle and do well. But it mostly matters what your major is going to be. And we'll deal with that a little bit more as we kind of get into, activities and things like that as well. But there's, again, the logical, if you're applying to a top school for pre-med, like I said, you want your sciences to be APs if you can. Okay, so speaking of why to take APs. So this is something that there's a lot of benefits to APs. You can earn college credit, which is great. So if you want to save money, you want to save time, you can place out of things, you can graduate early. But the other reality is if you go in with credits, let's say you don't need to take certain classes. If you don't want to graduate early or you don't want to, skip ahead, you can take fewer classes. So this is always an option. When you're picking APs, it can save you money and save you time or minimize stress when you get into college. Because the first semester or first quarter of college is usually overwhelming. There's a lot going on. But if you could take 1 or 2 fewer courses to kind of ease in, some kids really take advantage of that. Others just take fun classes because they don't matter. And so they could take, a class that's the science of relationships, or, a lot of schools have these really great marriage 101. Take it for fun, right? Take something that doesn't necessarily apply to your major, enjoy it. And then your APs just bought you the time to do that. This is the other reason to take APs. So this is they haven't released all the numbers throughout, but just looking at 2008 to 2018. So it hasn't quite doubled, but it's close, right? The reality is more kids take APs. So to be competitive, when we talk about how you compare to your classmates and other candidates, this is a big factor. So if everyone else is doing it, they're going to hope you did too. Again, the number that you can take, only you know what you can handle, and it'll change. By the way, as a freshman, what you think you can handle as a sophomore, junior, senior, you may be right, you may be wrong. It may be a lot more than you give yourself credit for. It also may be that things get much harder faster than you expect, and you're like, maybe I won't take as many APs as I'd initially planned on. But recognize that this is more common these days. So when you're planning your coursework for high school, just know that if you can take APs, do. Going to keep beating that dead horse. All right, here's your AP courses. So this is everything that's offered nationwide, or this is actually what College Board offers. Pally offers the vast majority of these, right? It's not necessarily all, and sometimes there's a year where a certain teacher who taught something isn't available and you don't have everything, especially with languages a lot of times. But you guys have the vast majority of these. So this is a good sense of when you're planning ahead, look at this list, see what interests you, what excites you. again, it can be related to your major. It could also just be something that you're excited about doing. You can be somebody who's pre-med who really loves the idea of music theory, right? That is great to colleges. It shows you love to learn for the sake of learning. So there's a lot on here, and there's some things that are, again, very obscure and very specific and very niche. And there's also things that are, AP calculus, right? Or you're building, and especially if you're engineering or any STEM related stuff, they love to see that. So scores, I see a lot of people ask when they're planning to take APs, they're like, what matters more, the grade in the class or the AP exam score? So as a younger kid looking ahead at how many of these classes you might want to take, recognize they both matter, unfortunately. So the grades matter the most, candidly, kind of at the end of the day, because it affects your GPA, it affects all these things. But if you got an A in a class and get a 2 on the exam, it's not going to look great to colleges. So you can see the scores are out of 5, right? So if you get a 5, you basically got an A in a college level course. That's what an AP exam or an AP class is, right? It's a college level course in high school, moves at a faster pace than most high school courses and more depth. So if you can get a 5, every school is going to be delighted with that. There's obviously no university on the planet or college on the planet that won't be happy with a 5. 4s, the vast majority are very happy with. So this is something, even the top schools, 4s and 5s, you should be very proud of and send. 3s, the vast majority of colleges, 3s are amazing and you get credit for. So most colleges say if you get a 3 or higher, we'll give you credit for that class. But know that when you start moving into that top 25 ranking, a lot of the schools say, we don't accept 3s, right, as for credit. So whether you list it on an application, I generally say do, because if you leave one blank and don't tell them an AP score for an AP class you took, they're going to assume you probably got a 1 or 2. So at least just own up to the 3. And 3 is a perfectly respectable score, right? But know that, again, Stanford's not going to be as impressed with the 3. Most colleges in America will be very happy with the 3. 1s and 2s, we don't really want to list on the applications. We just pretend you were sick that day. They don't need to know. But this is where the reason that this matters. So when you're looking at any kind of standardized testing, and this is standardized testing, right? Your grade is dependent on what your teacher thought of your work. If you were proactive and speaking up and engaging in class, if you were turning assignments in on time, not as much about your actual comprehension of the material, because I've seen perfectly, brilliant kids who understand the material well not get great grades because they didn't turn in assignments, right? Or whatever else was going on. But the AP scores is simply comprehension. So if you can get an A in the class and a 5 on the AP, it shows that your teacher loved you, you did everything right academically, and you knew all the material. But colleges, it's a red flag if there's too much of red flag's extreme, but if there's a big differential here. So let's say you get an A in the class, but you get a 2 on the exam, it's going to look like your teacher probably liked you or made the class too easy, right? And you don't actually know, compared to everyone else in the country, what you needed to know. So the AP scores, I tell you this ahead of time because you're younger. When we work with older students, a lot of kids don't prep for these exams or just take them seriously. They feel like it doesn't matter. They don't even sign up. You want to sign up. You want to register. You want to make sure you're ready. And, most of your teachers are wonderful at preparing you for this. But know that this matters as much as your grades in a lot of ways. So don't discount this and feel like if you get an A in the class, your AP score won't matter. Okay, so for you youngins out there, standardized testing is a hot mess right now. So this is the issue. There's a lot shifting. This pie chart kind of just made up, because the reality is some schools, like again, UCs aren't even looking at SAT, ACT, right? But when schools are, that matters more because not everyone takes AP exams. So that's the reason I kind of balanced it this way. But let's talk about test optional. Let's talk about test blind and where we see the trends going. So the reality is, at this point, if you were a senior today, what you're going to hear from everyone is that almost everywhere is test optional. And then again, the UCs, you've got some other options that have gone test blind. There's even some private schools, University of San Diego went test blind. They don't consider scores. So even if you got a perfect 1600 on the SAT, you're not sending it, or you can't send it, they won't consider it. So there are some schools that have gone that way. So full on test blind, don't consider standardized testing. The vast majority of schools for this year's seniors are test optional, which means that if you want to send scores and they will benefit your application, they invite you to do so. This comes down to, I'll tell you as this year's seniors, because we know what the situation is, but then we'll talk about where we think it's going for you. But if you're a senior right now, let's say you have like some crazy GPA, you have a 4.5 GPA, you have a ton of APs, you've done well in everything, but you're not a strong standardized test taker, right? And you're scoring way lower than you need to be kind of competitive at the schools you're applying, but your grades, your course rigor, everything else about you, even whether it's your AP scores as well, but anything else outside of SAT, ACT, if it's going really well, say over the summer, you cured cancer, you've done all these amazing extracurriculars, then you would go test optional. You wouldn't send it. It wouldn't help you to send a score that's lower than average if everything else about you is above average. However, if you've had some blips on your transcript, maybe struggled a little bit, had some less than desirable grades during COVID, right? Things happened. If you can do well on standardized testing, it's the way to compare you to the rest of the country and go, look, maybe you had a teacher who didn't like you. Maybe you missed a big assignment. So that B or C in the class was for one fluke reason. But if they can see that you're getting, fabulous scores on your SAT, ACT, it balances out. So they might look at it and go, okay, that's the exception, right? Because now I have more information and it's not about the school. It's not about the teacher. It's about a standardized test that the entire country or world takes. And so they know what those scores mean and how to value them. So for those of you who are younger and trying to figure out whether standardized testing is going to be around, the end of the day, no one knows for sure, because there are a lot of schools that have said they're going to be test optional through 2023. So this year's juniors, right? When they apply, they're going to still be test optional in a lot of schools. However, I point out Georgetown is just doing their own thing. So Georgetown is the only private school that I'm aware of at this point that is saying we're requiring tests. So even with COVID, Georgetown came forward and was like, don't care. We're only taking kids who've taken SAT or ACT. So we're watching seniors scramble because they thought everyone was test optional. And if they want to apply to Georgetown, they have to submit an SAT or ACT score. And that's now. So where it's going to be in a year or two, I don't see Georgetown backing down if during COVID they require it, right? So recognize that each school is going to have a different opinion. There are some schools that I know that are chomping at the bit to get back to requiring it. It makes their job easier. It's easier to compare things, right? It's easier to show scores or compare applicants when you have standardized test scores. Think about different high schools in LA. And like we even talked about the one private school that has, such great inflation. It's like they kind of know that, but it makes their job easier to like, all right, both of these kids have amazing GPAs, but this kid has amazing test scores also. So when in doubt, if you can do standardized testing you want to, the UCs are almost certainly never going back to the SAT or ACT. There is talk, and they've discussed creating their own exam, which I think is somewhat hilarious because they're trying to like minimize standardized testing, but they're like, but we're going to make our own. So that's still in the works. That'll be years down the line. But for people, especially like freshmen, we'll see if that's a factor. But SAT and ACT, if you're only applying to the UCs, probably won't be an issue. I can't imagine that's going to come back. But the rest of the schools in the country are fair game. And this is the problem, is you just don't know and you want to be ready. So think of this as an opportunity for you to basically build your resume, right? And build your application, look like a better candidate. When to take SAT or ACT. So this is something, I'm going to skip ahead just to the timeline. We'll go back to the difference between them. So this is something that it depends on what math level you're in. So you're not taking it 4 times, by the way. This is just kind of like 4 different sittings based on when the exams are. Look, you could take it at the end of sophomore year if you're so far ahead in math and all of these things. But the reality is the soonest you usually want to take it is the summer after sophomore year, beginning of junior year. That's if you finished Algebra 2 as a sophomore. So there's a lot of kind of chatter out there of like, just wait until end of junior year, beginning of senior year, you've learned more, you know more. That's because the average track that a student's on includes Algebra 2 as a junior. So if you haven't taken Algebra 2, there's Algebra 2 on both these tests. So you need to have it to be able to score really well. So let's say you're taking Algebra 2 as a sophomore. The reality is at the end of sophomore year, you know everything you need to know for the math section, right? And if you don't, you're not necessarily going to learn it next year. It may be something that your teacher skipped over in geometry or whatever it might be. So there's going to be things that you may need to go back and revisit and refresh, but in theory, you've learned what you need. The other sections, and we'll break down the test, but generally you have grammar and reading comprehension. There's a science section on ACT, which we'll talk about, but the reading, it's reading comprehension. Yes, you get to be a better reader the more you read, but I've yet to ever see a student where a score goes from like terrible at the end of sophomore year and brilliant at the end of junior year. Generally, it's like very marginal. And there's strategies, right? There's ways to just get better at reading, faster at reading, more efficient, more effective, knowing what they're asking for, knowing how to eliminate. That's stuff that you don't need to have junior year under your belt for. Same thing with grammar, right? I was like, there's nowhere in America right now that's teaching grammar, I think ever at all, but definitely junior year, right? You've either learned it or you haven't, and maybe you'll learn, you'll have a teacher who covers a few things, but you're not going through every grammar rule in the English language junior year. So this is stuff you either know or you don't, and either need to review or you don't. So again, if you're done with math, you're done with Algebra 2 as a sophomore, you're good to go. And then you could start that summer before junior year and start knocking it out. Recommend that you take it 2 to 3 times. Most schools that are accepting scores accept super scores. And the beauty of super scoring is that you have, like, let's say you take it 2 times and you have your math and your reading are really high on the first one, but you really focus on the grammar stuff the second time. Now you can combine these, right? And science or whatever it is, whichever test you're taking, but you can pick and choose the section scores and create a higher score at the majority of colleges, right? And again, this can change by school, by year, but it's very common, especially in a test optional world. And the reality is a lot of, especially the competitive schools like to do this, because when you start wondering how a college has an average of a 1550, it's because they're letting kids super score. Not everyone's hitting 1550 on one try, right? I mean, some kids are, let's be clear, but there's also the reality is like, if you let kids take them multiple times, then combine scores, it's easier to do. So then their national average is higher and they look better in the US News and World Report rankings. So the super scoring is a really strong reason to take it 2 or 3 times, but so is the curve. So these tests are curved. ACT is technically not a curve, but it basically adjusts for difficulty in a different way, which don't need the nuances of, but SAT and ACT both adjust the scores based on the difficulty of the exams. And what matters about that is that you could get the same number of questions right in April as you do in June, and one of the scores could be significantly higher. So taking it once and being done, I mean, if you have a perfect score, great, then you're done. But even if you're really close and you're an amazing student, I always recommend most people just take it the second time and see if you get a better curve, even if you've learned nothing, right? But the reality is generally people are like, okay, well, I need to fine tune this, or I was off on pacing. There's reasons that you would want to retest regardless. But looking at these kind of sittings, when possible, you want to be done with testing before senior year starts, before junior year is over even, because that summer before senior year, you're going to be working on college essays and applications. You're going to have a lot going on. You're going to have really challenging coursework in the fall. And frankly, even junior year, the second semester is challenging, especially if you're taking APs and you have AP exams to prep for and finals and all of these other things. So if you're in a position where you can test it the summer before or the fall of, or even the winter of junior year, you're going to make your life a lot easier and better by just being done and getting it out of the way. But I always, want to say you need to be ready. So let's say you're taking Algebra 2 as a junior. Then it depends, when you start, it depends on how high of a score you're looking for. Because if you're not a super strong tester, but want to get like a very good, respectable, above average score, but aren't looking for top 1 or 2%, right? You don't need to be in that top 99th percentile sort of score. Then you can take it at the beginning, right? You just won't know the Algebra 2, and it's not a huge factor. So on ACT, Algebra 2 is only 10% of the questions. But again, if you're trying to be in the top 10% of testers, you need it. But if you're kind of just trying to break national average and be a little above the 50th percentile, you might be okay without the Algebra 2 and just knowing which questions to skip and what you know or don't know. That's an option. But if you're taking SAT for what it's worth, SAT has more Algebra 2 on it. So you would potentially want to start a little bit later. But so what we see is kids sometimes who start prepping kind of around the new year of junior year, if they're still in Algebra 2. So they're doing other prep, but they're also simultaneously still learning more Algebra 2 as they go. So that's always an option. One thing just to look at on this timeline, I want to point out PSAT and AP prep, because PSAT prep is not usually necessary. And I want to make sure everyone understands the value of it or the lack of value of it. So if you take the PSAT sophomore year, let's say you get a perfect score. If you get a perfect score on the PSAT, no one knows, no one cares. It doesn't go anywhere. You can put a feather in your cap and be happy about it, and it's good practice. But the national merit scholarships and finalists and semifinalist awards, all the reasons people usually take the PSAT, you have to be a junior to be eligible. So just know that if you are a sophomore or a freshman looking at next year, you're welcome. I mean, take the PSAT, it's good practice, but prepping for it or getting really intense about it, there's really not a reason unless you just want to be more familiar and comfortable with the test, because that score won't count at all for anyone. It's just a practice test literally at that point. Now, junior year, if you can be in the top, you really top 2 to 3% is where you get national merit finalists, semifinalists, committed scholar sort of stuff. This can be worth scholarship money. It's definitely a recognition factor. A lot of colleges on the applications ask if you want anything here. But so what we generally tell people is like, look, if you're not roughly top 10% of your class or 10% to top 10th percentile, 90th percentile of, testing in general, don't prep. Like, don't waste your time. Don't put this much effort in, because unless you're in that top 1 to 3%, no one knows. Again, no one cares. That PSAT score does not go to colleges. It only is for national merit stuff, and they want official SAT or ACT if they're going to take it. Then the AP prep is just there as a reminder of like, that's the end of spring for every year, and it can be, there's a lot going on there. And then college applications, you can see most kids are going to start senior year starting around July, and most things are due by January 1st, with some exceptions on either side. Okay, so let's see. Whoop, there we go. Okay, so looking at SAT compared to ACT. You're young, so this, I'm not going to spend too much time on this at this point if you're mainly freshmen and sophomores, because you aren't probably taking this tomorrow. But just to make sure that you understand, picking the right test is more than half the battle. So they're very different tests and play to very different strengths. So knowing that the ACT, we'll just talk about very quickly, it moves much more quickly, but it's much more straightforward. So you have less time per question, but the reading is like, the answer is right or wrong. It's in the text. Just go find it. It's there. That's your answer. SAT gives you a lot more time, but is asking for the best answer. So it's like more in a different scenario. One could infer this would happen. What would the character do in a different situation? That's more of the reading on SAT. So it's a lot more tricky, but they give you more time to think about it and break it down. Again, math is more straightforward on ACT. On SAT, it's definitely more, they're applying it to real world situations, which is great and makes sense why that matters. But at the same time, if you're just good at math, ACT will test your math skills, right? ACT will test your math skills. SAT is going to be more, how do you apply it? Do you recognize it? SAT also has a no calculator section. So if you're not great at mental math, that can backfire. I had a kid recently who is an amazing, like, she took AP Calc BC as a junior. And when she took the SAT practice test, realized she literally couldn't remember how to subtract by hand. She could only do it on her calculator. So she's like, I don't remember how to subtract more than double-digit numbers. So there are things you'd be surprised, even if you're great at math, that can be a challenge for some people. Others are great at mental math and doing math by hand. But that is a factor. And SAT also has a section that's called the grid-in section, the student response, where you literally write your answer into the kind of, you're bubbling in the answer, but like 3.72, right? So you're not getting multiple choice on those questions. So that can also be a lot trickier. But the SAT, if you really struggle with timing and pacing, SAT can oftentimes be a better choice, but you have to be comfortable kind of letting go of questions and not getting in your own head when things are a little bit more in depth and tricky and things like that. ACT, the section that scares everyone off is the science section. So the thing I always want to point out, it does not test science knowledge. So there are 40 questions on it. Max 2 questions will test science knowledge. And that's like gas, liquid, solid, maybe pH scale, maybe the order of planets, things that maybe you learned in 3rd grade, maybe things you learned in 8th grade, and candidly, maybe something you just missed and never learned, but that's 2 questions max. The other 38 questions are going to be, even there's some common sense questions that basically, if you dump fertilizer into a river, what happens to water quality? That's a legit question from a recent test. It goes down. You don't want to drink water with fertilizer in it, right? There's others that are going to be more like, you have to read the graphs and charts and understand how to interpret data and make sure that this is, you can look at a graph and you can see correlations and relationships and understand what they're trying to get across with this data and the results of experiments, but they're not testing biology or chemistry or physics or anything like that. They're testing your ability to just interpret the data. So don't be too scared off by the science section. It moves very quickly. So it's usually the first time people take a practice test for ACT, it's not great. But as you get more comfortable with it, that section usually jumps pretty quickly, because once you're familiar with what they're looking for, it's not nearly as bad. Okay, so let's see, extracurriculars. Let's talk about this. This is where, as a freshman, as a sophomore, we talked about kind of the class choices and things like that. This is the bulk of what I want to really talk about tonight, because this is where you're starting to get involved. What you want to be thinking as a freshman or as a sophomore in high school is, how are you developing your interests? If you don't have any interests, how are you going to find them? So I have most families, most students that we work with end up saying, I don't know what I'm interested in. I don't know what my passions are. That's normal. That's how it should be. I mean, there's the exceptions of the kids who have that passion they've identified, but the majority of kids who are at the beginning of high school don't know yet. That's fine. But colleges want to see kids who are trying to figure it out. So all of this can be, we'll talk about all the different ways you can have activities, whether it's jobs, internships, volunteer work, but it can be, let's again say you're applying to super competitive schools. We'll stick with picking on pre-med kids. If you know you want to study medicine, you want to go to a top program for that, then it's not just about volunteering at hospitals. It's about, are there other classes you can take, maybe even at UCLA over the summer? Can you do like stem cell research over the summer with a professor at USC or UCLA or wherever? By the way, the answer is yes, you can. Most professors, as long as you're at the front of the line and have asked them before other people do, they're delighted to have free labor. Basically, you'll be there taking, getting coffee for them and filing things and cleaning up the lab, but it's experience, and it shows colleges that you're interested in that sort of thing and that you're engaged in kind of the academic world, right? And academia applies or appeals to you. So there's that extreme, right? If you're like hardcore kind of science looking, it's not kind of science, but science looking at top things, you could do history research with a professor too, if you want. You also don't need to do anything like that. Depending again on where you're applying, what you're interested in, it could be something, let's talk volunteer work, right? So let's say you have decided that you care about dogs and animals. Most kids who determine that, they're like, my volunteer work is going to be to work in an animal shelter, or, maybe raise money for dog food, right? For the animal shelters. That's great. That's wonderful. Colleges appreciate that you're making the world a better place. No one's going to have a problem with that, but it's not unique. So what you want to be thinking about is like, what are my interests that are more unique? So for instance, I had a kid recently who was interested in helping animals and veterans. And an organization that I love talking about this one because I think it's great. I actually think it's a fabulous organization. It's called Pets for Vets. It's literally taking shelter dogs, rehabilitating them, and training them to be support dogs for veterans who come home with PTSD. That is an organization that writing an essay about your involvement in and how it impacted you and why it mattered to you is way more engaging than I dropped off some dog leashes at the shelter, or I cleaned up dog poop for however long. Those are all great things, but when you have a more unique angle by senior year, that's better. So I want you thinking of freshman and sophomore year as your attempt to try things. So if you're like, I think I want to help animals, great, go do a normal generic, I say generic, not in a bad way, like go work at an animal shelter, see if you like that. And then if you do, let's think about how you can develop it if you're a freshman and sophomore year, if you're a sophomore, junior year, and then senior year. And we find more and more niche ways that allow you to write essay topics or essays that are going to talk about an activity, again, in a unique and dynamic way where it sounds like you truly had an impact, right? And you also truly cared. It wasn't that you did 5 hours of volunteer work at, Susan G. Komen Race for the Cure, and then went and cleaned up dog poop for 3 hours a month later, right? They want somebody who has a passion for helping whomever they choose to help. And that can be anything. So, think of if you want to help, whether it's immigrants, whether it's women. So if you want to work at a battered women's shelter, you can work at basically, soup kitchen equivalent. You can donate clothes. You could also be the one to reach out and say, I'd like to coordinate and find somebody to come in to teach these women how to put together a resume and apply for jobs. Right? If a lot of shelters don't have that, and they would be delighted. And it's not like the kids running this, but the kids coordinating it. And as a student, you've had a much more profound impact than just showing up and serving sandwiches one afternoon. Right? So you're just for now trying to find what matters to you. So think of these first couple years of high school saying, here's what I care about. Here's what I want to get involved in. And then over the next couple of years and towards the end of high school, you're getting more involved in taking on leadership roles or, having more of an impact in your community on that. But again, it could be academic research. It could be taking, this is kind of more academic, but you could take classes again at UCLA or at SMC. If you want to pursue something that you don't really have high school options to pursue, sociology, right? Go take a soc class. That's great. They'll love to see that you've done that. But then it's like, how does that apply to you? So a lot of this, when you're looking at how colleges view applicants, they're looking at how everything fits together. And is there a clear narrative and a clear interest that you've developed? If you haven't developed it, that's fine. But again, the importance is that you're trying. So the kids that struggle the most in application processes are the kids that maybe freshman, sophomore year didn't join clubs, didn't do much volunteer work, because then if they start junior year when they know it matters, they're starting off as just somebody who joined. They can't have leadership really because they're brand new. They don't really know what they want to do. They haven't explored it in depth enough. And again, candidly, if you join, the Red Cross Club and you show up to meetings once a month, that doesn't make a great essay, right? There's not that much. It's about how you've impacted that club or what you've done. And that only comes with time invested in that organization throughout high school. So you start young, right? You start getting involved. A lot of people always wonder, is it better to have like paid work or internships or volunteer work? The answer is all. Like it's not, it depends on what you're applying for, right? If you are looking for, obviously, like you want to be a social worker, then of course, maybe you lean that direction. But the reality is, if you have impacted your community, if you have shown great leadership or made a difference, that matters more than anything. So if you look at this lovely little pie chart, community impact is 50%. The reason is that any college, which makes perfect sense if you think about it, they want kids who are going to change the world. And if not change the world, at least change their campus. And if not change their campus, change their dorm, right? And have an impact on their roommate, if nothing else. It's about taking your skills, your interests, your passions, and having an influence and making somebody better off because of it. So this can be, the whole pets for vets sort of thing. It could be, I have a girl right now who's very interested in accounting. I'm an English history major, I don't understand, but she's very interested in accounting. And she found a program that actually, even though she's a high schooler, trains her to help underserved communities with their tax returns. So she's gone through this rigorous training and is going to be helping people in the spring with their taxes. I was like, to me, it sounds terrible. I was like, I wouldn't want to do it. But to colleges, it sounds amazing, right? It's something where she's actually investing in this and she's found an interest and found a way to benefit the community because of it. So when you're looking at how to spend your time freshman, sophomore year, just start throwing things, you're throwing darts at a wall, not even at a dartboard. You're just going, let's see if this sticks. Let's see if this is interesting. If you think you're interested in STEM, see if there's a robotics team. If there's not, see if there's an environmental club, right? Like find things that are kind of related and see what sparks to you and what you're interested in. And then as you get older, again, you'll develop these things in more unique, interesting ways that set you apart from candidates. But this is where I feel like I always stress people out because we're talking about and, right? Everything's and, do more, do this, do this. It depends on where you're applying. There are some schools that are just going to be delighted you join clubs, right? And that you're involved in your community in any capacity. And that they assume that if you join a couple clubs at Pally, you'll join a couple clubs when you get to their campus. Great, right? Others want to be like, did you cure cancer this summer? Like, we want the best of the best. You need to be super invested in what you do. So the range is broad, and without getting too specific on any of that, just know that the depths you go to depend on where you're applying. Leadership, I like to point out, is not as straightforward as people think it is. So yes, president, captain, that's great leadership. But it could also be, like, let's say whether it's the Pets for Vets thing or whether it's, volunteering at women's shelters. Leadership is also taking initiative and reaching out and maybe saying, I'm going to get other people involved, right? And telling your friends, going, hey, let's go do this. Whether it's a formal club at your school or not, you can still coordinate something and go have an impact, right? That ties back to community impact. But your leadership doesn't have to be an elected position. It's great when it is, but don't feel like that's the only way to do it. The other reality is, we're going to show you in a second what it looks like on the applications in your description. But again, if you're just showing up to things, your role or involvement is basically nothing. You're a body who shows up in the room and, that's great, better than nothing, but you're not having an impact in that organization or that club or that whatever. So I'd rather, and colleges would rather, see applicants who are involved in fewer things in more depth and actually having an impact and having roles. And even if it's a big club, you don't have to be, again, president or treasurer. You could just say, I'm going to coordinate this bake sale, right? So at least when you're describing things, you can say coordinated a bake sale in your activities description, as opposed to showed up to meetings and let other people do the work, right? So anything you can show that has that impact is the really important thing. Notable accomplishments I have here 10%, because again, some of this is a little random, where if you're looking at notable accomplishments, most people don't have a ton. So that's why I put it as 10%, because usually it's not a huge factor. But if you've won national awards and national competitions, anything like that, if you have cured cancer over the summer, right? You've done all these great things, that 10% is like 100%. Then the rest doesn't really matter if you have something really amazing. But this is also something to keep in mind. If you are, let's say you're an aspiring screenwriter and you're a freshman, I want you thinking about this from a college's perspective. If you're applying to film school, they want a kid who's pursued film throughout high school. Great. How have you done that? If you start entering contests and competitions, you've not only proven that you're dedicated to this and that you're probably somewhat prolific because you're turning out new things for new competitions, but if you can win something, this is great. This also, I like to point out, look, if you can win, again, national awards, that's amazing, but there are local ones that are still impressive. And the reality is not everybody knows how impressive something is or not. I always point out there was a Rotary Club that had a photography competition, and because they needed to decorate their walls. And this is like years ago, I still love this story. And this kid applied and submitted all his photography. He won first, second, and third place in this competition for Los Angeles because he was the only one who entered. No one else entered. Colleges don't even know that. All they know is he was good enough to win first, second, and third place. And he was applying as a poetry major, or not poetry major, sorry, photography major. So there are things where getting involved, but having records, it also shows you willing to put yourself out there and face rejection, which colleges value, right? So if you're entering poetry competitions, you're clearly not terrified of not winning, right? So if you don't win, you're not going to be brokenhearted and devastated. You're going to be fine, because otherwise you wouldn't have entered in the first place. That is very appealing to colleges by definition, that you're even entering, but clearly when you place or win or have any recognition, even better. All right. Okay. So this is what is on the Common App. This is literally a screenshot from the Common application. So without going into much depth, because this is years off for you guys, Common Application is an app that the UCs have their own app, Cal States have their own app. Some schools, Georgetown has its own app because it just goes rogue at the time. But the Common App, the vast majority of colleges in the US use this. So what it is you have one personal statement and you have this extracurricular activity thing, this one long document, you fill out the same information once, and then there are supplements for each individual school. So they'll ask their own questions or want different information, but this goes everywhere. So, and even on the UC app, it's very similar to this. It's only a tiny bit different. So the reason I want you to mention or to see this is think of this as a freshman or as a sophomore. You see on the far left, it says grade level, right? Have you been involved 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade? How many hours per week? How many weeks per year? Then top line is positions held, honors, won, letters earned, the name of the employer if you've got a job. And then the bottom line of each one is activity. That is 150 characters, not words, 150 characters to describe what you did in 4 years in an activity, right? So the reason I always emphasize this, the younger you are, the more this matters, is that if you can check boxes for 9, 10, 11, and 12 and say, I've been committed to this activity or involved in this activity for 4 years, or even 3 years if you're a sophomore in 10, 11, 12, so many applicants that we see only check 11 and 12, right? Or 12 even, or just 11. And they started doing stuff so late that there's no consistency, there's no investment in things. So you're young enough that you can start to develop this, and the clubs and organizations that you join or the causes that you get behind, the teams, if it's sports, if it's music, whatever it is, being able to fill out that I've been doing this for all of high school, again, shows a true commitment to it. Hours per week and weeks per year, I'd like to highlight because a lot of kids think that if they do something once, they're going to put it on here, but recognize it doesn't look great if what you're putting on there is I did it for 4 hours, 1 week, one time, 1 year. You may not list it then, because then it's like, that's one of your top things you've done. So you want something that you've done more frequently. And this is also something on the Common App, you get 10 spots. So you can have 10 activities. There's plenty of kids that can't come close to filling 10 activities. And there's others who've done kind of surface level work in 25 activities. You would rather have, I'd rather you have few that have showed depth and, real commitment. And so you want to be able to save more hours per week, more weeks per year, more years. Right. And then for that description of the activity, remember, you're trying to think of this as, if you said I joined French club, that they don't know anything, describe what you've done, that you've coordinated French cooking lessons, you've done whatever it is, you helped, a French exchange student like get acclimated, pick a thing. But that's what they care about, is really what you did, the highlights of, how you accomplished things, how you were involved. Paid work goes here too. So this is a question I get a lot. So if you're thinking about like how to spend your summers, and obviously your age determines what kinds of jobs you can even get. There are a surprising amount that will take 16-year-olds, and there are even some out there that take 15-year-olds. But this is also where internships with like family friends can come in handy if you need to. But working, bagging groceries, right? Scooping ice cream, working as a Subway sandwich artist, pick a thing that feels menial, but actually takes work ethic and takes humility and takes responsibility to show up on time and not get fired to do something that you don't love. Colleges eat that up. They love that because it also shows that life wasn't handed to you on a silver platter, that you had to work for things and that you know what it's like to have some really major jerk come in the store and yell at you because their ice cream was too melted, right? Whatever it was, it's something that matters. It speaks to your character. It speaks to your work ethic. So I always see families who are like, but his lawyer, his grandfather or his uncle or his mom or somebody is a lawyer and can get him an internship at the law firm. That's also great if he wants to be a lawyer. But it's usually pretty clear when it was a connection, a family connection. And on that note, on the applications, you have to list as parents where you work. Internships where you work don't carry much weight. Don't do it. There's obviously times where it's still useful, but I see it a lot, especially in LA for the entertainment industry. So if you're in Hollywood and you're in film and you work at DreamWorks and your kid suddenly lands an internship at DreamWorks, that's great. But also they probably didn't earn it. Even if they're the most amazing person on the planet, your connection clearly had a role in that. So looking for internships that are super well known is either being competitive or more obscure and at a smaller place. So you can even, for instance, Boeing, if you have somebody interested in engineering, an internship at Boeing, they have paid and unpaid. Doesn't matter, by the way, it's about the experience. So if you want to make money off of it, great, but it's not like it's volunteer work if you do unpaid. So whichever's fine. But doing something like that, where they know that you had to beat out 95% of the other applicants, that matters more. So either something that's really competitive or something that just shows work ethic and humility is amazing. And so colleges see different values in different things, right? Obviously one shows that you really know what engineering is like and what the career might look like. But the other one is going to show more, again, just work ethic and humility, which is always impressive and exceedingly rare. So if you can show these things, colleges are, again, going to eat it up, do it. So if you're ever trying to figure out what to do and you can't figure out what you want to do, that's a great way to kind of kill time and do that. By the way, showing initiative, anytime showing initiative is good. But let's say you're too young to get a job, but you want to start a business. Like I had a kid show up at my doorstep who offered for $10, you could charge a lot more than this, but offered for $10 to like power wash the inside of my trash cans. And I was like, done. I never want to do that. I'd be delighted to pay you $10. But I thought about it, I was like, this is actually really interesting and a great essay for college because you've got somebody who, again, is taking initiative, being proactive and kind of entrepreneurial in spirit and doing something no one else wants to do. So it shows hustle in a different way. It's not just, but I have another girl who has great handwriting and she's started charging to do calligraphy for like wedding invitations. And she reached out to, stationery stores and asked if they could maybe recommend her, and it worked, right? So there's ways to get paid jobs that are not as formal if you're too young or you don't necessarily want to work those types of jobs or you want more flexibility. So there's ways to get creative about this. Okay, so then, if you're looking at essays, this is the Common App personal statement essay prompts. You're young, you don't really need this, but I want you thinking about this because the younger you are and the more you're aware of this, take notes, create almost a journal of ideas for topics. So this is the other thing I always warn people and prepare them for. When it comes time to apply to college, however many essays you think it is, it's more. So the average student that we see usually writes 20 to 30 essays. It can be a lot more depending on where you're applying. It can be a lot less. If you're only applying to the UCs, it's 4, right? 4 essays. It's personal insight questions. They go to all of the campuses. You don't have to write unique ones. Easy breezy. But if you're on the Common App, most schools have 2 to 3 supplemental essays that they want to ask you about. Some have 0, some have 8. It just depends on where you're applying. So recognizing you're going to have to write a million essays about times you've been challenged, things that have inspired you. When have you witnessed diversity in a different way or experienced any kind of discrimination? There's a million questions that seniors just freeze and they're like, I have no idea, right? I don't remember any of these things happening to me. I always say, look at this list. And by the way, if you know where you want to apply to random schools, look at their essay prompts. Stanford has one that's always give us an example of your intellectual vitality. So the sooner you start thinking of what your answer is to that, the better. But play it in your head. And as you're going through high school, think about some of these and just take notes. You're not trying to write essays. You're not trying to be too paranoid or overly proactive about this. You're trying to make your life easy when it comes time to start writing, going, I have a bank of ideas to pull from, right? I've started thinking about these things ahead of time. And so it also gives you a sense of things that colleges care about. These questions are being asked for a reason. So recognize that this, and I hear a lot of students and even parents say that, if they've had nothing bad happen to them and they've had no adversity, they're like almost disappointed because they're like, oh, what am I going to write about? But you also see kids who've had adversity who don't shape essays in the right way. So one of the things, as somebody young who's starting to think about these things, if something horrible has happened to you, right? Whether it's an injury, an illness, yours or your family members, anything has been, really traumatic in your life, it could be a wonderful essay prompt or essay response, but it could also not be, because you need to think of this from the college's perspective. It's not just about saying, check out this bad thing that happened to me. It's about how did I respond? Why am I a better candidate than another kid who didn't go through this, right? So I have students who want to talk about, whether it's going to rehab, whether it's having eating disorders, whether it's having a mom diagnosed with cancer. None of those things independently actually make you a stronger candidate, but what you've done on the other side of them might, or you may not want to talk about them, just depending on what happened on the other side of things. But recognizing if you talk about a parent having cancer and your takeaway is, and I learned to help do the dishes and I had to step up and fulfill roles in the household, that's what a good human would do. So the college expects that of you. So it's not necessarily the thing. Now, if you're trying to say, I want to tell you about this to explain why I couldn't do more activities at school, very different, but that wouldn't be a personal statement. You'd mention that in there's additional information section. So when you're thinking of ideas, if you feel like something terrible has happened to you, I'm not saying don't write about it, but I'm saying think of how you're going to shape it or think of what's come out the other side. So for instance, I had a girl who struggled with eating disorders and a lot of mental health issues and really got wonderful help, came out of it and started an organization at her high school that at first was kind of just not for fun, but like a casual thing, but it blew up and it ended up they had 37 chapters at different high schools by the next year. And she was literally flying around California speaking. And she turned it into this huge thing to help, and also working at middle schools and trying to build, body positivity. She turned it into something that was really great, not just I got through this and now I'm better. So when you're thinking about what you're going to write about, just keep that in mind, because that is one of the biggest, honestly, issues we see with essays. So as things happen to you, but it can be small things too. It can be a moment where you realize you're just at peace and sincerely happy, or this conversation you had with your grandmother really made you realize something, or you saw something happen and it made you really stop and think about, wow, that's crazy that the world's still that way in 2021 or 2022, whenever it is. Think about these things and just, again, write down notes, get more comfortable with talking about yourself, because you're going to have to. You're going to have a lot of essays, and most teenagers say there's nothing unique about me. The sooner you start realizing what is unique, and your parents can help because parents know what's unique about their kids. Think about it, start brainstorming and coming up with that narrative of, how you're going to kind of shape this. So beyond that, let's see, hold on. Something's wonky with my, and okay, there we go. So this is everything that we were kind of, talking about, the big picture things, but the main takeaway that I want you to think of as a freshman or as a sophomore is that you're developing your interests. You're starting to show colleges who you're going to become junior, senior year, and you're taking your grades seriously and you're challenging yourself, but you're not overdoing anything. You're not stressing yourself out too much. You're still, think of it as you're kind of a kid freshman, sophomore years, and you're a young adult junior, senior year, and colleges know that. So they want you starting to develop interests and exploring ways to challenge yourself, but not expecting you to do crazy things at this point. But you want to be thinking ahead. So anyways, okay, so I know we've got some questions. We'll jump into that, but if you have any questions for us, you're welcome to sign up. We offer Pally Kids free 30-minute, just one-on-ones. If there's anything you want to talk about that's more personal or private, you're welcome to sign up for that. That's at the bottom of the screen. But if you have questions that are not personal or private, then Heather, you want to jump in and tell me what we got?
Yes. The first one we've got was from a while ago, but just talking about how do colleges view it when schools limit the number of APs a student is allowed to take?
That's a great question. So remember, you're always compared within the context of your high school. So if they know, which they would, the high school makes it clear whenever there's a limit. If there is a limit and you are constrained by that limit, then they don't hold it against you, right? It's not your fault if your school says you can't take more than 2 APs this year or 3 APs that year. One thing that I always want to point out, though, is that there are exceptions made, and there are, especially some West Side private schools that have limits in place, but we have plenty of clients who are taking way more than that because they got exceptions at the school. So I mention this because if anybody has kids at other schools, just be aware that you may think you're playing by the rules, but other people are not. So that's just one thing to kind of keep in mind. But colleges do know if there is, in theory, a cap on there, and it's not held against you if you are, limited by that.
Awesome. We also had one person ask about subject tests for SAT and asking if they are canceled indefinitely or if it was just for this year.
They're gone. So they don't exist anymore, which, I actually think it was a great opportunity for kids who were not in AP classes to prove their, abilities in certain subjects. So for those of you who aren't familiar, subject tests existed forever. And the idea was you could take a subject test in US history or subject test in literature or Spanish and prove your abilities on a nationally standardized test, but not necessarily at the AP level. And they were canceled indefinitely at this point. I mean, look, there's always a tiny chance that colleges will be outraged and demand they come back. But with the kind of climate out there, with the kind of more test optional pervasiveness, they're supposed to be gone for good. And I think they are. So for better or worse for everybody who, if you've been good at them, it's unfortunate. But if you wouldn't have been, then great. You don't have to worry about them.
Awesome. And I think you covered this a little bit, but could you take the SAT before taking the 11th grade PSAT?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no reason that you can't take them out of order. Recognize the difference between the PSAT and the SAT. PSAT it's a slightly easier test because it's meant for younger kids, right? And it's shorter. So if you take, and I've had plenty of kids who've tested, they're done with the SAT at the beginning of junior year, then in October, they take the PSAT and they get national merit or whatever it is, and they're done, right? They finish the SAT before PSAT, that's totally fine. Other kids obviously don't even start prep till months later. So it's just based on where you're at. But if you are ready to take the SAT that summer, then go for it.
Great. So if a freshman is taking Algebra 2 now, when should they be taking the SAT? During sophomore year or, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I love this question. I like the motivation and commitment. This is also impressive to be taking Algebra 2 as a freshman. So if you are, it depends on the kid. So I would be honest, we had several clients this year that we did test prep with starting beginning of sophomore year. They were done by winter of sophomore year. They had their test scores in their pocket. They were able to send them to colleges, when they were ready to apply, and they were done. Most kids still need a little bit more. Like, I think starting after freshman year for testing for most kids is a little rough, but it is something where you can take practice tests, and there's official books out there. We offer diagnostic exams on weekends. I know Compass does stuff with Pally too. You can find ways to just get a sense of where you're at, and it might be like, oh, I need a lot of work, but it could be that you just need to prep and actually spend time dealing with strategy, or that you actually need to learn more that you haven't learned yet. Maybe not in Algebra 2, right? But in theory, you should or could be ready to prep at the end of freshman year, but most kids are not and need a little bit more time to kind of mature, but that depends on the kid. Again, there's a lot of exceptions to that. So that was not a great answer because it's kind of depends on the kid, but I would say that's something to explore because, again, the sooner you can knock it out, the more stressful college or high school gets, get it done sooner if you can.
Cool. We also had a couple parents asking about being well-rounded. If you're interested in a particular area like engineering and you participate in something like Mod UN, is that wasted? What does the college see about that? Or are they valuing that well-roundedness?
So this does depend on where you're applying. So this is something where if you're applying, liberal arts colleges that are much smaller communities and want their kids to really interact with each other, don't care necessarily as much about the depth of something. I mean, they want depth, but they care about breadth too, because you're interesting, you're dynamic. state schools and some of the more competitive kind of mid-sized schools, like, think the Ivies, Stanford, care more about the depth. However, think of it this way. They're looking at how you're going to benefit their community. So if you're going to be in a situation where you're going to be an engineering major, but you're still going to be involved in Model U, and especially if you're really good at it, that still is a skill. That even just means that, whether it's that you can negotiate and debate, or whether it's that you're aware of, international stuff going on, great. All of those things count. So I would never say stop doing it, but recognize that back in the day of dinosaurs, when I applied, well-rounded got you in anywhere that was a top school. So my friends, I went to Northwestern, my friends who went to Stanford, Harvard, Yale, they were all great students who had good test scores, played an instrument, played a sport, and had a leadership position in student government. They went to the top schools, right? That's what was expected. Now they do want more depth than breadth. So it depends on where you're applying. But again, schools that are maybe not in the top 25 love well-rounded because they don't expect kids to necessarily have that area of expertise. One thing I always give as an example that kind of shows the preference for some of the top schools. So Vanderbilt has one merit scholarship that goes out a year. That's just because they like a kid and they want to give money to somebody. Everything else they do is really need-based. But their presidential scholarship, one of the recipients years ago, which again, still cling to the story because I think it's hilarious, had the world's largest collection of carnivorous plants. All right. So it's super unique, super obscure, weird kind of, but also to colleges, really interesting. That kid was not going to be a botany major. Like it was like whatever it was. I think it was pre-law or political science or something. So they loved that this kid had this interest that was completely unrelated and he just went for it. But if he had just joined like the ecology club, it wouldn't have necessarily mattered as much. So well-rounded works to your advantage. And it's never a bad thing. And in life, it's a good thing, by the way. So I don't ever want to discourage it. But colleges, it's the thing when you have a calling card that sets you apart, that is usually the thing that really gets you in. And it does not necessarily need to be related to your major. I think that's the important thing to differentiate.
Awesome. We also had a parent ask before signing up about how to add extracurriculars to someone who's an athlete or someone who has something like that takes up a lot of time. Like, how do you add in other activities or things like that? How do colleges expect you to do that?
So if you're looking to apply, you're going to be a D1 athlete, you're going to be a top recruit. Here's the reality. We're going to talk about just athletes very briefly here and then kind of answer that question. One of the things I point out is I don't care how good a student athlete is at their sport. You can blow a knee. You can have a coach that was recruiting you get fired and a new coach comes in who has different recruits. We see this all the time. You can have, lots of issues, whether they're medical, whether sometimes it's the college has nothing to do with you and your skill, but things can go wrong with recruitment. So what we always point out is like, at the end of the day, you have to be ready to apply to colleges without sports, just as a backup, as a potential. So keeping in mind, if all your eggs are in the sports basket and you blow a knee, right? Then what kind of candidate are you for most schools? Because if you can't play, let's say you're a top volleyball player, but you can't play volleyball at their school, they're not going to be as impressed that all your time went towards volleyball. So sometimes just kind of rounding yourself out a little bit and showing other interests and showing that you do volunteer work and you're involved in your school in other ways is great. The reality is if you're a top athlete, or by the way, top musician, top actor, actress, whatever it is, if you're the best at something in an activity, you don't have time necessarily to do everything else. But if you're applying to high academic schools or more competitive academic schools in general, admissions has to accept you. It's not the coach's call. So I've also seen kids who are great at what they do, but they're applying to a school like Amherst or Brown or somewhere that's a really strong academic school. And admissions is like, yeah, but they don't do anything else, right? So even though the coach wants them, admissions doesn't necessarily. But of course, if you're good enough, usually the coach can be like, they can get admissions to pull you through, right? It just depends on your level, but I would always be prepared that if something goes wrong, you need a backup plan, you need to have other activities, and it's finding what you can fit in. And you may not be the person who has, 10 random things you do. You get involved in maybe one type of volunteer work, one thing that benefits your high school, and maybe some paid work if you have time in between. But it could even be, again, if you're an athlete, you could do your volunteer work, could be coaching an inner city school or working at a summer camp in the summer. It can be related. It just depends on, again, what type of athlete and what type of school you're applying to. But the reality is they know that you don't have that much time, but admissions still cares. That's kind of, again, not the most clean cut answer, but that's the difference, is what coaches and admissions want are different.
Cool. We had another parent chime in and asking basically how legacies plays into this, and if you have family or alumni who have attended an Ivy League, does that play a prominent role in the process or not?
So it depends which Ivy, and it again is changing year by year, because part of, the political kind of environment that we're in, trying to level the playing field, a lot of people have talked about legacy is one of the biggest issues, right? And not always, but that's, some schools are like, oh, we're going to get rid of that because it's not fair to the other kids and the other applicants. There are some schools, legacies only get flagged if you've donated a certain amount, and it is high. It's usually 8 figures. So there are times where being a legacy does you no good. Like I think Harvard took it off their application. But other ones are like, yeah, tell us, and how many people have gone and what years were they? And that's cool. And we know you're going to continue the legacy, right? And you're going to be a super involved person on campus. So legacy, it depends on the college. And again, just because they accepted this year, they may not in a year or 2 or 3 years. But I will tell you, generally, I think the best way to think of it, unless the school actively says we will not consider legacy, think of it as a thumb on the scale. Now, by the way, if your name is on the side of the stadium, that's different. But if it's just you went there and you want your kid to go there, if it's between them and another kid, if it was 50-50, now it's maybe 51-49 in favor of your kid. But if it's more than that, if another student is more qualified, they're not going to get in over a legacy. So there has been a shift away from that, but it does still matter and it can still benefit. I will tell you, if your legacies, the best thing you can do for if your kid's the legacy, if you went to a school that you want your kid to go to, introductions are the best way to do it. So if you are an alum, reaching out to friends, or if you know anybody on the board or know anything like that, it's not about having somebody on the board write a letter. It's about somebody on the board or you yourself getting them to be able to chat with somebody in admissions and get some FaceTime, even if the school doesn't necessarily do that. That's usually a favor they'll do for alumni's kids and legacies, is getting that FaceTime. Then if you have somebody who really likes you, they might advocate for you a little bit more. That's the best way to use legacy if the school that you're a legacy of, or your kid is a legacy of, that allows that. But being an alum can help at some schools and not at all at others.
Okay, we had someone ask, is it better to take AP classes at your school or community college or college classes outside of your school?
Excellent. So generally, I would recommend taking the APs when they're offered and then going above and beyond. Again, I was the queen of and, always like, do this and this. But if you start with taking, let's say you're just crazy, you're the math kid who's taking algebra 2 as a freshman, right? If you're taking algebra 2, you're going to max out. You're going to be done with AP Calc much sooner than anybody else. If there's no multivariable, or even if there is, taking that at community college, or taking linear algebra, if you've taken multivariable, things that aren't offered at the high school are the best ones to take at SMC or UCLA, wherever you want to go. But if it's offered at your school, I would generally take it, because you also want to see them engaged in your own community and show that, right? But don't feel like you have to go to community college to take something. But I would tell you, like, for instance, if you're interested in business, a lot of kids go take intro to business at SMC. Most business programs aren't that excited to see intro to business. It's like, find something more unique, maybe something on supply chain management, given everything going on in the world right now, right? Find a more niche thing that you could only take at community college after you've taken econ or AP econ in high school, or simultaneously. Anything else?
Okay, it looks like we are all set.
All right, we've hit the bottom of the barrel. I love it. So if you guys have any other questions, any concerns, feel free to reach out. But if not, you're in great hands at Pally and you're in good shape. But wish you the best in this process and the rest of your high school career.